Zustand, my favorite library to mispronounce, everyone else's favorite library to use for state management in React. Before we go into why we're talking about it today, I need to settle this pronunciation thing once and for all because my chat, they're mad at me right now. If you didn't already know, we film a lot of videos live, and at this moment, they're upset with me. I started Googling. I found this very fun poll on the React subreddit where it seems like my Zustand has successfully pierced the brains of React devs, but we need to hear it. We need to properly hear the Google pronunciation. So for the first time ever, y'all get to hear the right way to pronounce Zustand on my channel.
Zustand.
And that is the last time you will ever hear Zustand pronounced correctly on my channel, because I am never, ever saying it that way. I don't care. With that all settled, let's talk about why Zustand's a community favorite. As soon as I saw this blog post, I knew it had to be a video, so let's do it. By the last monthly post, our sample app, Timo, was finally ready for some experiments. So in this post, let's look at Zustand to see why it has become a favorite in the community. To do this, I'm going to refactor Timo to use Zustand so that we can see what it's like in practice. What is Timo? How much code can TanStack query save? Oh boy. Yeah, I'm not going to read this one live, but if you are interested, I'll leave the link in the description. These posts actually seem very useful and super, super practical. But I want to figure out what Timo is. It has 3 screens, one for logging in and signing in, another for viewing and changing time entries, and a screen with a timer for creating new time entries. Now we know what the app is. Now you guys know that there's a great blog post about TanStack query with it, React query. I'm sure that one is nuts, that it's just showing how much shit you can delete. I had a great convo yesterday with an employee at a popular AI company about how they could use React query to build a way simpler front-end experience, and it was mind-blowing for both of us in the process. So once again, React query is the shit. Search Theo React query, and you'll find a bunch of my YouTube videos explaining why. We're here for Zustand. Zustand. Second and only time you'll ever hear me pronounce it even close to correct. So what is Zustand? It's a small state management library that provides React hooks to manage the state. It is based on the Flux pattern, like Redux, but it's similar to how Redux simplified the original Flux pattern. Zustand simplifies it even further. For example, here's how you would set up a simple store with a count value and an action to increase it. Import create from Zustand. Use count store. Create, we have the set function here. We return an object that has a property count, which is starting at 0, and then it has increment, which is a function that you can call. And we give this an inline function definition, set, and in here, set can take a function as well, and that function gets called with the current state, and then we can use that in the response here. So it's similar to when you use something like useState. The state updater function can either be called with a bare value or it can be called with a function that it will call with the current value. Super simple API, makes it really easy to do stuff like this. Does have some catches with TypeScript though, and we'll get into those in a little bit. To achieve the same result with Redux Toolkit, you would have had to set up a new slice, add the new slice to the root reducer, and also set up the creation of the store and its provider if it hasn't already been set up. With Zustand, you can access the count value in the increment action from the generated useCountStore hook. You just call it. We called create here, set it as this value, and now this value is a hook we can use wherever, and we get all the values here. We use count, which is calling countStore.count, and then we increment it with countStore.increment. Nice and simple. Since Zustand mostly consists of a few React hooks, its NPM package is only 3.1 kilobytes minified, which is 44 times smaller than the base React package. If you don't know, React is quite small, but React DOM, which is where the bindings exist, is a bit larger. It's 13 times smaller than Redux as well, which is 40 kilobytes minified. To be fair, Redux Toolkit has a bit of additional bloat, but it has to because Redux Toolkit's the only way to make Redux usable. I also like that he's not comparing it to vanilla Redux, which is a shit show. He's explicitly comparing to Redux Toolkit. Good call. Refactoring Timo to use Zustand. Since Timo was already using TanStack query, I only had to rework the user authentication and profile storage to use Zustand. In the plain React version and the TanStack query version, this was done using React context. Refactoring this to Zustand took around an hour. In many cases, it was almost a drop-in replacement since I already used a hook to access the underlying context values. Let's take a look at this. It's readable, but not quite as readable as I would like. So here we have the Timo common hooks use user, and we deleted that and replaced it with use user store. Nice and simple for a lot of places. The tedious part of the refactor was changing the components in the common package. I wanted to keep separate copies of Timo with each of the libraries we took a look at, so I set up the repo as a mono repo with each version stored as a separate folder. To cut down on the duplicate code, I also created a common package to store code that was used by several versions of Timo. Sadly, some of the components in the common package use React context. They won't work with the Zustand version of Timo because I was using Zustand instead of React context. So I had to refactor these components to be pure and then refactor the previous versions to work with these changes. I still kept the components that depended on context in the common package, but moved them to a separate folder to show that they were not pure. This is a very strange use case, to be clear, where you have 3 user experience-wise identical versions of the same app, and you're trying to share components between them. I find that sharing components between projects in general is kind of rough. It's part of why I don't love component libraries and much prefer things like Tailwind, where I can define them myself, or things like ShadCN, where they live in my code base. It's pretty important to have your shared components be really, really like low-level things. So instead of user button, your reusable component is button, and then you wrap it with the user button that's somewhere in your application code. So it doesn't surprise me this was somewhat painful because a lot of these components can't be pure. And once you abstract non-pure components and they have expectations about things like which contexts are available, shit falls apart fast. So I'm not surprised this was painful, but I'm pumped that he continued to push through it and make this work. The other thing that stumped me for a moment was handling side effects in Zustand. It seemed to have the concept of middleware, but I couldn't find any docs about how to write our own. The docs only had instructions about using the middleware that came with the library. Why did this matter? Well, since I was using HTTP-only cookies to authenticate with the API, I had to make a request to the API when the app started to verify whether the user was already logged in. I could write an action using Zustand to make the request, but how could I run it whenever the app started? Ooh, I'm going to share my weird solution to this problem, and then I'm going to see how they solved it. So what I recommend for these types of things, if this is like a fundamental, the application experience is different based on whether or not this exists, I wouldn't put this in the global use user store like this. What I would do instead is use a context. I know the whole point is we're moving off contexts, but Zustand contexts are actually quite useful for these cases. So what I would have done is I would have created a context for this store. And at the top level of the app, I would have done with like React Query or something, the check to figure out if the user's authenticated or not. And then I would pass that to the create store function. I would actually require this take a user in as part of its creation and pass it the user once we have it, and then render something else entirely if we don't have a user. But I would have code here in app at the root that actually figures out if you're authenticated or not, and it generates a different state, either the logged out state or the rest of the app with the store already instantiated if you're logged in. This obviously only works if your store is dependent on that value and you don't want it if the user isn't signed in. But I've used this pattern a ton, especially in the Ping code base. Ping, by the way, is the video product that we built and went through YC with to make it easier for content creators to do live collaborations. There was a lot of complex state in this app around which devices are available. So if I go to my room quick here, there's a lot of complexity around which devices are available, and once they're available, which things can we use? So the way that I handled this, if we go back to the page here, that one loading spinner is actually handling a couple different things. The first layer is a check to see if you're authenticated to join this call or not. Then we check, do you have the right permissions for devices? Like, does the browser have permission to use video cameras and microphones on our page or not? And once all of that is completed, then we render the Zustand store that actually manages your devices. So the Zustand store that keeps track of which devices you have and are available and the video and audio tracks they're creating does not get created. That store does not exist until all the permissions are established. So that's how I've solved this problem. I actually find that nested Zustand stores like that, where they are created conditionally based on other things being met, helps you escape from having to do a more complex state machine with all these different potentials. The idea of a state machine that only exists when you are ready for it to might feel weird, especially if you're treating it like a global. But if you don't treat it like a global, you're just using it as an API for defining what can be accessed where. I found it was actually quite pleasant. But now I'm curious how this author handles the problem. And thank you, Agora, for the shout out for Ping. It's both really cool as like a user of it, but also was such a crazy exploration of different things you can do in React. And it definitely leveled up my React skills massively. Oh, and in case this wasn't clear, a Zustand context means that this store is available in any children components. So if you use this at a lower level, like in the player in Ping, you can't access that store from above that component, but you can from there and below, which I found to be a pretty nice way to manage these things in a lot of cases. So there you go. Now you hopefully understand why these things work this way. Back to this. The first solution that came to my mind was to create a custom wrapper component that had a use effect hook to run the action. But use effect hooks are evil, and I try to avoid them as much as I can. Yeah, I don't love this. But then I realized we can interact with the Zustand store outside of React. So we can run the action immediately after the store is declared. Another plus of this approach is that the API request is only made once during development. If we use the useEffect hook instead, like the previous version of Timo, the request would be made twice since React triggers useEffect hooks twice when React strict mode is enabled during dev. Yep. I got into a long back and forth with Dan Abramov back in the day about this, specifically because of the nature of nested stores and triggering specific events. In this case, connecting to a call. I'm going to do the thing I never should do and actually look for the source code for this. So here is how we handle the connection to your chat room in Ping. Because in Ping, we have a little chat. I should probably reopen that. So in Ping, we have the little chat here where I can send messages. It also keeps track of who's in the call, which requests exist for people to join the call, and a bunch of other random things like that. That is handled through a service that I do not recommend called Ably. I'm scared to say more because I legitimately think they might sue me. They are one of the most toxic businesses I've ever worked with, and I'm sure I'm going to get emails just for saying that much here. Anyways, the room manager context provider here is a component that gets mounted when we know you're allowed in the room. So we now know that you're authenticated to join. That's part of the props that come in here. I then use traditional React state to create a real-time store, which is, again, Ably's way of connecting via WebSocket to their store. By default, I don't actually instantiate it, though, because I have a use effect here, which I use to create the real-time Zustand store. And then I set store to new store. And now I have this store here in state. And then I have a cleanup here that handles all of the different things you have to do to leave in Ably, because there is no one leave in Ably. You have to do like 15 fucking things. And then I have a really nasty stringify to make sure that we only rerun when the config changes, even though some of the keys in this are objects that might break this. Obnoxious, but by far the easiest way to handle that. Don't do this. Don't ever do this. It works, but don't do it. And then we return the real-time manager provider, and the store for it is created using real-time store. So what is this create real-time Zustand store thing? That's where the interesting stuff happens. As somebody in chat was hinting at earlier, you don't actually need to do this stuff in React. And what was there is just how it's bound to React. But the vast majority of the logic, in particular where the state changes occur, all happens outside of React in this file right here. So in here we have a couple types. We have the user presence data, which keeps track of what the presence info, which is which users are here and what devices do they have available. We have the room manager store, which has the Ably client, the public channels, the presence channels, which are like who is here, and then the private channels, which is something that I actually don't know how much we're using. Oh, it's for embeds. Or some things can't connect to those, which is embeds, but that's for private data messages, things like that. I have the provider and the store coming from the Zustand create context helper. The real-time store config, so this is the stuff that's specific to this store's existence. We have the slug, which is what it's connecting to. Connect private channel, which is should we connect to the private channel or not. Publish presence, which is do we publish the present state or not. And do we use the embed process for authentication, which is a different way of authenticating. This is the stuff you pass in when you're instantiating the store. Then we have the create real-time Zustand store helper function that I wrote. It takes in that config. It creates the Ably client. It connects to the public channel based on the slug that we passed. It attaches, it then binds the analytics events, it then catches if there's any errors, and we were obsessive with analytics because Ably was breaking constantly and they were gaslighting us nonstop about it. So we over-logged and analyzed everything here so I could give them logs proving that their service was broken. Here we have public channel.on failed. Again, obsessive logging because they don't give anyone way to know when it's broken. I have the private channel, which is conditionally connected, not if it's not. So here we set let. If we're supposed to connect, we connect, bind all of these things. Same with presence. And here's where things get interesting. We create the store, and you'd think I would just return that, right? But that's where things get more fun. If we keep scrolling, I actually bind a bunch of things to the stuff that we created here because we created the store with all of these values, but I also want to keep track of presence data. I also want to know what messages were sent. I have a lot of other things that I want that are not being handled here. And I do that below. Because this store is an object that can be interfaced with. You don't just have to call this in React with a hook. I call it down here with store.setState. So without even touching React at all, I have a bunch of logic here that updates the store and updates the values in the store just by creating it. Because in this creator helper function, I bind all of these things after the creation occurs. This isn't the only place we do this with Ping. We also do this for our video provider, Agora. Similar pattern here where we instantiate the use state for the Agora store. I use this create Agora call store helper. set that to state, and then we have the cleanup for if you leave or unmount the component. We call the internal Zustand Agora provider, we pass it the created store, and then we can render our children, and all of those will have access to this store. And again, if we go look at the logic here, hop into store, you'll see it's very similar. Agora client, create simple Agora client, store, vanilla create, set, and we return the Agora client, the call state, the participants, volume map, all of these additional things. But again, afterwards where things get interesting. I actually bind all the Agora listeners that keep the state up to date. So here, I new store.set state whenever new participants come in. I just do this by looking at the vanilla client because, by the way, the Agora client doesn't reliably let you know who is or isn't connected. You have to ask it who's currently connected. So I set up this helper to update the current connected participants. And then I have all of the different events where a user joins or leaves bound to call this function so that the state machine gets updated when any of these events occur. Then I handle volume. The volume handler was so hard because doing this in a way that didn't cause nonstop updates that made everything update constantly, that was a bit painful. But I have that here because we wanted to debounce and do whatever we could to keep track of those volume levels in a way that didn't suck. And then the volume indicator is what triggers those updates. Then we have the connection state changed, which if you're banned, we will set the state to double join because that's the only time that UID ban occurred with the way we had things set up initially. And that would set the specific state and then leave in those cases. And then we return the store. A bit chaotic, but the value of this pattern is that I can do all of the different things that this client does, in this case, Agora. I can set those all to update our state directly without having to do that with effects and React. This all exists externally in vanilla.js, and then Zustand makes it really easy to consume this stuff within React. So it basically lets us make this store, do all of these updates, write the new store.set state calls in here, and now I can reuse this code in other places, other frameworks, wherever else. But importantly, this code still works in React because I can now call this as a hook. So that's how we solve the problem. And that's also quite different from using the use effect to update the store. So the difference, to be very clear, is that in this example, the user store always exists. No matter what, the user store exists. And then these conditions are triggered to update the store to the state that the user wants it in. What I did instead is the store is only created once we know this. So if we have to connect via ably, if we have to authenticate the user, we have to do any of those other things, we do that. Then we use the results to determine if and how we should create the store. So let's see how he handles it. It's interesting how getting used to the React way leads you to overlook simpler solutions in plain JS to the same problem. It's actually a funny quote with what I just showed. So here, we have the instantiation for the store and then just call useuserstore.getState.fetchUser. Yep, this is basically what I'm doing, just slightly higher level. My impressions of Zustand. After refactoring Timo to use Zustand, I have to say that I really like its generated hooks. They're easy to get started with and they can easily be fine-tuned to prevent re-renders. This makes it a perfect fit for managing state that has to be shared across several parts of a React app. Oh boy, you found some good context. Let's watch this one. I'm curious now. The volume working. Oh God, pre-mustache Theo. So ugly. Why did you guys ever let me look like that?
I'm sure y'all are having a lot of fun on Twitter.
Making fun of Bryn, our old co-founder, for the doesn't listen to Nickelback. Good days. Classics. Good find. Ones in chat if I looked like that when you first started watching my content. I want to see some ones for the pre-mustache crew. Before my videos were clickable. That's a lot of y'all. Zeros if you came post-mustache, so I have that for comparison. New today, so 0. Yeah, you're definitely post-mustache if you're showing up today. 0 by a month. Damn, you were right on the line. Cool to see. Always interesting to see when and how people showed up here. It was overdue haircut, no mustache, Theo. Oh shit, you were early. For those who aren't familiar, here's OG, needed a haircut badly but was too busy, Theo. Back in the day. This was even pre-YC if I recall. Yeah, YC started in January of 2022. So this was so early. So early. Anyways, speaking of early, I want to show some stuff in Dogecoin Simulator because it's touched on here with these selects, but I just want to show it in my own code base. This is a dumb app I made during the Dogecoin rush way back. It's on GitHub, and I want to show some fun things that I did in here. So I have my game engine, and this game engine is entirely built in Zustand. And the game engine is pretty aggressive because things are updating constantly. There's a tick that's firing multiple times a second. And that triggers a bunch of other stuff to change. Like when I buy, numbers go up and down. There's a lot of things going on in this project that cause it to update state all over the place. So I'd be pretty careful about where state does and doesn't get updated. Here's where I create the default state instance. Here's where I actually load it from storage. So I save this all in local store. And I have to abuse combine, which is the only way to make Zustand type safe at the moment, to do a bunch of crazy shit here in order to create all of the updaters and states that actually cause this game to behave the way it's supposed to. But what I want to showcase is the actual hooks that I consume things with. I need to show how the selectors work first, though, so let's start there. So see all of these use game store hooks? Your immediate thought's probably, why? Why not just call use game store and access all the keys off it? Well, by doing it this way, I have selected just this state. So if I was to delete all the other hooks here and just have this use game store where I grab state.usd, this component will only update when USD changes. If I just called use game store, then this component will rerun when anything inside of the game store changes. And since we're selecting like this, we're telling Zustand, hey, quickly, before you update my component, get this key out of the object and check if that changed. The diff isn't happening on the entirety of game store. The diff is happening on the resulting selector here, which is what was cool about the thing I was just showing with the game engine. If I go back there, yeah. Not only can you select this way, but you can also calculate things and do additional math and work here. And as long as what you return here is representative of if an update should occur or not, because it's different from the previous value, if it's different, it will trigger an update. If it's the same, it won't, which is super, super handy for just dumping a bunch of shit in state like I did here. There is so much stuff going on in the store, but now you only have to access and trigger updates on the parts that you want. To go back to the article, I'm sure he's about to cover what I just showed here. Yeah. We have the count store, and then we have const count, use count store, state.count. So this will trigger when the count changes. If we go back to how this store was defined up here, we have two things: count, which is the value that changes, and increment, which is a function that theoretically shouldn't change. So if you have a button component for increment that doesn't know the count, it shouldn't update when the count changes. And you can be sure of that very easily by making the increment call to use count store, but we actually select the increment key. And since we did this, this will never trigger a re-render because the function never changes. I also like how Zustand tackles async operations. It's just calling set with the result. Then the action can be run in a synchronous context. No middleware, no promise chains. This is what I was showing before with all of our Agora enably stuff, where a lot of that was promises. And then on the .thens, we would trigger whatever behaviors we wanted to. So we have this fetch user, we try, const users await get user, then we set the value. If there's an error, then we set it to the error state. So, the biggest benefit of switching away from React context. The biggest issue with using context to share state across several components is that any change to the state will cause all subscribed channels to re-render. Moreover, changing the context value also causes child components within the context provider to re-render. Since the context provider usually wraps the entire app ends up re-rendering. Timo used to have this problem in the profile screen where saving the user details would cause the entire app to re-render. You could memoize to get out of that. I almost want to read the source code. Oh, he calls it out here. You can solve this with memoization in multiple contexts, but it's tedious. But by using a state management library like Zustand, you can avoid these issues more easily. Zustand doesn't require you to wrap the entire app with a provider component or hawk, and it sends updates directly to the generated hooks. So the entire app doesn't re-render when the state changes. Since you can also subscribe to specific state values and actions with Zustand, you can also make components re-render only when the state relevant to them changes. You know what? I want to prove that this isn't that big a deal. Does he have source code somewhere? He does. Okay, React source app.jsx. Okay, I found the problem, almost certainly, but let's confirm. Where is that coming from? Is the user context provider one of the common packages? It is. Okay, common context user context provider. Ding, ding, ding. This should be memoized. The problem is that the children are going to rerun because there is no indication that this can be treated statically. If you were to memoize children before rendering it, you could avoid almost all of the re-renders here, I'm pretty certain. Yeah, I'm almost positive that would fix this. Do I clone it to prove that? Do we make this already too long video far too much longer? So I'm going to save this. Yeah, see that? The whole page update? That's the thing I think we can nuke. Let's go straight in to test that. So my hypothesis is that this isn't memoized properly. Only one way to find out though, which is to go all the way up here to the user context provider, const memo children, and do that. Not sure if it's smart enough to handle the hot reloading for that, so I'm going to brute force resetting of those. Now I'm curious, test Theo v2. I'll change this to L. Save. Fuck, it's still updating the whole thing? Really? A. No, it's not. Was it before, though? Should probably have confirmed that in the console ahead of time. User context provider. Children. It's not. Interesting. So what is causing everything to re-render then? How is it being consumed? If we go to, oh, it's common. Where I need to be is the profile component. Oh, that's why. Const user is use user. That would do it. Yeah, we only want clear user from this. So that's the issue, is that we're selecting way more than we want from this hook, and that triggers updates that we don't actually want to have happen. That would not be fun to optimize for. I now understand the pain. Yeah, if this context is being used for all of these values, as well as for exposing that specific function, that sucks ass. Yeah, never mind. Why did I ever doubt the author? Clearly they have a case here that sucks. Yeah, it's basically impossible with context to select just one thing. So in this case, what we want isn't the whole use user. We just want clear user, which is a function that theoretically should never change. But sadly, because use user is a context that provides all of these other things in it, it has the user object, it has the authentication state, it has additional values, and all of this is part of what this provider is giving us. That's why this sucks. Theoretically, we could wrap this with another provider that's like user context actions provider. That is just the functions, which should never change. And then in here, we could just consume that and be good. Do I do the miserable thing of that? It feels hellish, but I think I can do it relatively quick. Source packages / react / source. Yeah, we have it here as well with customize user. We have it at the top of profile, which is where we just were. We have it in change password as well. Yeah. I see the problem now. So the reason Zustand's super useful for something like this is if this was like a use store, then I could have store.user.clearUser. And now I could select just the clear user function and ignore everything else, which keeps it from having to update when it shouldn't. But this example seems to be a lot more ironed out than I was initially thinking there when I had my initial pushback. Yeah, the Zustand version, when you save, only updates specific parts of the page instead of forcing the whole profile to re-render. Because if we look at the code, I'll just go to the same place in the Zustand version. Zustand source routes profile.jsx use user store state.clearUser. And now we just have the clear user function. No additional stuff has to be done. We have to create a new function here. We can just pass that to button and it works. Dope. Actually, a really good example. Nice having the 3 different solutions in one repo to compare. If you're curious about the difference between vanilla React, React plus React Query, and Zustand, you have a great place to look to compare all of those. Zustand gets a thumbs up from me. It's a lightweight package that is well thought out and approachable, especially if you're familiar with Redux and the Flux and Redux pattern. This is probably why the community's fallen in love with it. What if you hate the Flux pattern and anything else like it? In next month's post, let's take a look at the atomic patterns for managing state, which also come from Facebook and Meta, as well as Jodi, which is taking over from Recoil as the de facto library for this pattern. Fun fact, both Jodi and Zustand are part of the Poimanders collective, PMN DRS. They are legends. The amount of cool shit they build is unbelievable. This is where React 3 Fiber came from, where React Spring and Use Gesture came from, where a ton of crazy 3D stuff came from. But it's also Zustand and Jodi as well. Great stuff. Yeah. One of the best sources of good React solutions, and also a great resource for general full stack TypeScript problem solving. Awesome project, awesome crew, awesome stuff that they're building. Any opportunity I get to shout them out, I take. Also, my VS Code theme, which I get asked about all the time. If you're this late into the video, I'll let you know the secret. This is the Poimanders theme. Yeah, this was great. Shout out to Prabhash for writing this. It is a great post, and I will definitely be here to see the Jodi one that you update in the future. Check out his blog if you want to hear more about the React context version, as well as the React query version. The links are all in the description. Check out the blog. And until next time, peace nerds.